Welcome everybody. Good afternoon, I guess, wherever you are. I see a lot of friendly faces here, and I am happy to welcome you all. This is a session in the context of the Israeli project on extending, accelerating, deepening, widening the scope of PhD students' professionalization, opening doors to PhD students. And now we have with us one of the most experienced publishers in the world of academic publishing. Dominic Byatt, our guest today, is the publisher for academic social sciences and humanities in Oxford University Press. He was educated at University College London, Exeter, and Nuffield College in Oxford. He has been publishing books at OUP since 1993. And in addition, for commissioning one of the world's leading lists on political science, he oversees great deals of the OUP Press, academic publishing in economics, finance, business, management, and religion and Bible. So one of the leading, maybe the leading academic press, one of the leading commissioning editors, 27 years of experience. Thank you very much for being with us, Dominic. And the floor is yours. Thank you again.
Thanks so much, David. It's an absolute pleasure to be here talking to you today. So I'm going to just quickly give you an overview about what it is I'm going to try and do during the course of this talk, just so you've got a kind of a sense of the terrain and where we're headed, and it isn't just me burbling on in front of you on your computer screen. So I normally say, actually, with this, that it's fine for people to chip in with questions at any point, and I'll take them whenever. If I'm being unclear or if something occurs to you, that's fine. But I think, given the nature of Zoom, we'll save all questions to the end. If you want to put them, I think, in the chat, then I'll come to those at the end of the presentation, and we can pick those up, and I'll do my very best to answer them. I'm happy to answer as many questions as you want to throw at me. So do please, if something occurs to you, even if you think it's a bit silly or trivial, then chuck it at me, and we'll see if we can get an answer back to you. But anyway, the overall thing I'm going to be doing, first of all, is to give a kind of the context of academic publishing, particularly in relation to the social sciences, although it's pretty applicable across the whole of academic publishing. And by context, I mean the sort of deep historical stuff, the way that that particular bit of the industry, but also academia has been going. And a lot of this will be quite familiar to you. But I think it's interesting and it's important because I think from the outside, publishers' decisions can seem a little bit arbitrary at times, but they're usually acting in a broadly sane and rational fashion. So some of that context will give you a sense of how they come to reach the decisions that they come to. So I'll say something also about the way that some political science books have developed, and the world of books has developed over the last little while, and that's a lot of that will focus on the extraordinary technological revolution that's been going on over the last 20 years or so, since the internet started to get purchased and digital technology started to dominate our lives and be the main medium through which we communicate. That change has meant that publishers have changed and adapted and responded, and I'll say something about that, and then I'll say something a bit more immediate about the current circumstances, or the bizarre circumstances we find ourselves in terms of the pandemic. And the message there is going to be very much that the pandemic has accelerated trends that were absolutely already there in terms of academic publishing. So that's going to be lots of the general stuff, and then we'll get down to something which is a bit more nitty-gritty. We'll say something which I hope will be useful to you about how to go about getting published, how to get your work out to people in book form in a way that's going to maximize the impact that it has, which is obviously the thing that we're all interested in, that we already want. So we'll move from the general to the specific and the practical, and then at the end we'll have a fun, and I use that word very loosely, fun look to the future to see what that might hold in terms of academic publishing and how that relates to the work that you might be doing or the career that you might be engaging in at its start or wherever you are in your career. As I say, well, questions into the chat, and I'll do my best to answer those right at the end. And I should warn everybody that this is going to be a relatively depressing hour. We're going to spend it in each other's company, but let's make the most of it. So, there has been, I alluded to it just in that intro, there's been a massive change, okay, in academic publishing. It's in a way it gets understated. It's not, we haven't really described the extent to which publishing has just been fundamentally revolutionized in the last 20 years. We know UP has been going for 550 years, and I think that the changes we've seen in the last 20 since the advent of, quote, digital are far and away the biggest changes that have occurred in that period. I mean, it's the biggest change since Gutenberg invented the printing press. And you genuinely can't overstate its potential impact, and actually now its impact on the world of academic publishing in particular. Now, the fundamental thing that's happened is that the cost of quotes publishing has absolutely plummeted. If you think about it, back in the day, for those of you that might remember it, before there was an internet, if you'd written an academic paper, let's say, on a particular topic, and you wanted to get it into the hands of somebody who was, for instance, for the sake of argument, based in the Australian National University, then in the first instance, you'd actually have to find out that they existed and that they were potentially interested in your work. You'd then have to print it out, and you would have to post it. You'd have to get it paid for and posted out to that particular person to read. Now, that is a very time-consuming, inefficient, and expensive way of getting your work read by potentially, let's say, one person. Now, in the digital world, in the internet world, in the interrelated world that we're now in, all you have to do is just that. I mean, the change in cost is absolutely phenomenal. And it's very easy to forget that. And I think it's important for us to hold on to that because its ramifications for publishing are absolutely immense. And in a way, it's quite surprising that the impact of that particular change has been so slow in getting purchased. So we're now seeing real signs of it speeding up. And I think the impact of COVID in particular has really ramped up the move to digital rather than print publication, which is effectively what we're seeing. But nonetheless, that is absolutely fundamental. And so I think it's really helpful if we can hang on to that because it's a revolution that we are still working through to some extent. Anyway, I'm going to move on to political science now. And a lot of the things I say about political science are certainly applicable to the broader social sciences and the humanities as well, to some extent, if you do happen to be working within those frameworks. So political science has seen massive growth over the last 20 or so years, 20 or 30 years, in fact. APSA membership is not much under 20,000 people. The International Studies Association conference, which when I started 28 years ago nearly, was quite a small outfit, quite a small conference, now runs to 7,000 people attending. So it's grown absolutely hugely. But the nature of the growth is kind of interesting, I think. It's quite fragmented as a discipline, and that fragmentation, that compartmentalization into quite small little sort of focused areas has tricked out as the size of the subject has grown. And you find that despite a lot of rhetoric around interdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary, pan-disciplinary approaches, that there isn't a huge amount of conversation of a kind of significant research level basis going on between the different components of political science. So, and in a way, that's very different to a subject like, for instance, philosophy, which, somebody working in let's say, epistemology might also be working in metaethics as well. That's not unheard of. So that has an impact in terms of the size of the market that any given sort of publication on a particular topic will be appealing to, the size of the potential audience for that particular topic. But political science is thriving. It's a growth area. It's an area where there is increasing amounts of research work of, I think, a terrific quality, ever improving quality as more sophisticated research methods have become available to us, and it's doing well. It's, you know, the world has become a more interesting place, arguably, than it used to be, and political scientists, broadly conceived, are grappling with that. So it's an area of growth in publishing. So if that's the area you're working in, then I think it continues to be even more so a great area to be working in. But the nature of the growth in political science has been particularly interesting, I think, and that again has had an impact on the publishing scenario, the publishing environment that we see. And one overwhelming change in the time that I've been working for OUP is the move to the preeminence of the journal article rather than the book as the kind of the main currency of research dissemination. When I started, the process was definitely underway, but you know, the book was still very, very important. It was probably still the kind of Rolls Royce of research dissemination, and now that isn't true. It's the journal article sort of reigns supreme. An interesting question is, why is that the case? Well, I think one reason is that the sheer quantity of research has increased, and so as that's grown, then just by necessity, the focus of research has become narrower and narrower and more refined, and so more specialized. And so there are many topics now that are studied that we're getting great insight into, but nonetheless, they're not topics because of their sheer sort of scale, their size, that can sustain a book in terms of audience, in terms of market. Another reason for this, and it's a sort of cynical reason, but the pressures on scholars' time have increased as well as the world has become more complicated for them. And you know, a journal article with the best will in the world takes a lot less time to research and write than a 100,000 word monograph. So those are two sorts of important reasons. I think the third would be that economics has, to a great degree, been the kind of paradigm social science, and we've certainly seen that in terms of the methods that political scientists employ, or certain great swathes of political scientists, obviously not all of them, but also in terms of kind of very technical approach to the subject now, even for those using mixed methods. But there's also a parallel there, I think, in terms of the culture of publishing. And you know, the journal article is absolutely paradigmatic for economists. In fact, not even that now. It's sort of working papers posted in Repec or wherever. So yeah, again, there's been a sort of a cultural move, I think, away from books and much more towards journal article publishing, or publishing at a smaller length, a shorter length. Another shift, a very important shift that has also shaped the publishing environment quite a lot over these last few years has been the focus on measures of impact, especially citation indices, Google Scholar in particular, I suppose, more broadly across all the humanities and social sciences. And that has been particularly problematic for books because, you know, Web of Science or whatever, historically, books haven't featured in. So that has been a problematic thing. And so the career currency and the impact currency that's available to, for instance, journal articles is not, or historically has been less available to books. Now that's been changing more recently, but it does have a very significant impact on the writing incentives that academics face. So, no, all these things are not a wholesale move. There are a lot of books published, as I'm sure you're very well aware, but it's been a very significant trend over the last 25 years or so, and you see it absolutely in its impact on the good old-fashioned US tenure file. You know, in the past, it almost used to be the case that a tenure file was judged by its thickness, and because it used to have two decent university press scholarly monographs, let's say. And now, of course, if you publish in APSR or World Politics or one of the absolutely leading journals, then that if you two articles in that level of journal, in that impact factor journal, is going to be worth more to you, I think, in career terms and in terms of tenure, for instance, than publishing a university press monograph or even 2 university press monographs. So it's journals is to a large extent where a lot of the action is. I think in terms of publishing and in terms of research outputs now. And we've seen an impact in terms of our monographs that's fairly obvious. And one crucial one is that there's been a very significant decline in individual sales over the last 25 or 30 years. So now you'll also see, sort of bizarrely, if each volume is making less money, we're selling fewer of them, that publishers have responded to that in large part by simply publishing more titles, which does seem sort of irrational on absolutely the face of it. But I'll come on to that in a little bit. The reasons for the decline are library budgets have remained flat. Journals tend to price up year on year, and that's especially true of the commercial journals publishers. Then there are the various research assessment exercises that go all around the world. Now, that's especially true in the UK, where we have the REF, which is the government-run process by which certain sorts of government funding are allotted to departments, and the journal article has again become, just as valuable to a scholar having their research outputs assessed as a book. And so again, the writing incentives are really clear there. If you can write 10,000 words or 8,000 words as opposed to 100,000 words, then naturally there are going to be much more submissions of journal pieces rather than books. And also another important factor in terms of that sales decline is the fact that there's a huge amount of material available online now, and the reason for that is because of that revolutionary dynamic that I was talking about right at the start of this, that it's really cheap and easy for people to actually, in principle at least, make their work available to almost the entire planet. So there's also as well an expectation generated around online dissemination, which is that it is free, that people don't have to pay for material. And again, that creates a big pressure on publishers who are actually trying to make some sort of return on the material that they're publishing. Another huge thing, and actually each time I've done this talk, it's become bigger each time, another really important structural change in the publishing environment in the last few years, again brought about by the digital revolution, is the rise of open access publishing. It's obviously been very significant news in the STM world, in journals, especially over the last decade or two, I suppose. But it's growing at the level of the book as well. There is talk that the next research exercise in the UK, the one that I mentioned, which is due to happen in 2027 in theory, I think, although it may get delayed, may indeed have a mandatory open access component. So that's put the cat amongst the pigeons in terms of the UK research sector. But it's become big news for books, and we certainly have, like a lot of other publishers, we have a very active and significantly growing open access books program. I feel slightly ambivalent about it. I mean, I think some of the basic principles of open access publishing, certainly motivated in terms of the sciences and technology, are, they have real force, I think, and I think that that's fine. The picture is more complicated in the humanities and social sciences, I think, because with the science model, there is usually one funder. They'll run a lab, and then the research outputs from that lab really there's a direct causal relationship between the money going in and then the research outputs coming out. It's a very simple causal relationship, and it's kind of unitary. With the social sciences and the humanities, that isn't always the case. It's probably not even the norm. More often, research will be a function of a lot of different grants from smaller funders, and so the sort of the direct causation is a little bit more difficult to trace. And there's also an argument around, I think you can make a very clear argument. I think the COVID crisis has really underpinned that the freely available research without restriction can aid the progress of humanity. Absolutely the case. Well, I think, with political science, there is maybe some truth in that, but then also there's the potential with open access and open access constraints. If the money isn't in the system, as it were, and there's a huge amount more money in STEM subjects than there is in the humanities and social sciences, then there's a danger that a sort of a publishing microclimate, a dissemination microclimate gets destroyed, a way in which publishers can act in a kind of virtuous way to help select and bring to prominence and facilitate the impact of crucial key research. But we can come back to that a little bit later on in the talk and maybe pick it up in the questions. So in journals, the solution to the open access pressure has on the whole been an author pays model, and that's the one that publishers have also tended to adopt with open access books as well. So OUP has a very active, as I say, open access program in which we have a kind of a prorated fee depending on how long the publication's been out, or if it's open access, gold open access from the start, then there's a fee which currently stands at £9,500 sterling plus UK value added tax, which is currently rated at 20%. And that's pretty ballpark, I think, for a lot of publishers. And it's certainly allowed journals to continue to be, very lucrative in some instances, either for the learned society that might own them or for the publishers that own them. It's not entirely clear to me how long that can sustain itself, because the value added that those learned societies or the journals are bringing has been potentially spectacularly undermined by the fact that the costs of entry, the costs of dissemination online have been reduced hugely compared to the old pre-online situation. And I do wonder to some extent the extent to which that scenario, the journal's preeminence, charging either at the supply end or the demand end, can actually carry on. But again, that's slightly speculative, and we can perhaps return to that towards the end. I've actually always thought that the bigger threat for the scholarly community, and I use the word threat with some advisory, is the fact that as it currently stands, employers on the whole don't insist on ownership of the work being produced by a particular scholar while she's on the payroll. So, which is, that's an academic freedom which has got a very long pedigree, and we can very plausibly argue is hugely important for all sorts of reasons, but nonetheless is very different from a lot of other sectors. So, for instance, publishing, everything I do during my OUP time, OUP has some sort of ownership claim on some sort of copyright in, I suppose. So it's interesting that scholars have this arrangement whereby they can actually, as it were, although there's not much money in this area now, profit from publishing their research. So that's, there's a tension around that, I think, that is tricky for publishers potentially if it were to trick itself out, and it's certainly also tricky for scholars as well. Anyway, the picture is not the happiest one in terms of individual print sales, certainly over the last 20 or so years. When I started, a decent monograph in print, and bear in mind there was no online presence at that particular point, would sell maybe in its first year, which would be the metric that we would normally use to gauge the success or not of a particular volume, would sell maybe 700 copies perhaps. And now it's significantly under 300, I would say, as an average, probably heading towards 250. Now that's a huge drop, clearly. Now it's been offset by the fact that this material is now available online through university libraries largely, potentially also as an ebook, but certainly through university libraries, through the sorts of online products that publishers like Oxford with Oxford Scholarship Online and Cambridge Core provide. So it's not, in terms of actual usage, I think, and in terms of people actually engaging with the material, I think the picture is actually probably a net, a positive one. But in terms of, crucially, the money that publishers can make out of selling the content and bringing the content that they publish to market, then that has reduced very substantially, because the brute fact of the matter is that we could make more money on publishing material in print, when print was the only medium that was available, than we can do by publishing things online, for all sorts of bundles of reasons to do with its accessibility, and just the fact that there are all sorts of expectations around the price of these things, and pricing material online is a really quite tricky thing to do. So these are all challenges that that publishers are facing and continue to face and grapple with as the digital revolution continues to unfold.
Yeah.
I'm going to say,
Dominic,
sure.
may I interrupt you now, sure, and make sure that you'll answer some of the questions that are coming to my mind, and I think I know some of the people here, despite all those kind of developments, wants to publish in OUP or CUP, and they are expecting, I think, also kind of guidance how to publish with OUP.
Yes, David, I've got this is all just sort of a bit of throat clearing. There's plenty on how to actually go about getting published. So I'm going to be getting onto that pretty soon. Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely. Go on.
Fantastic. So I'll rip through, to get on to the more practical how-to elements of this, I'll just rip through how publishers have responded to that, because it does also have an impact on the way in which they have to think about the book project that you might bring to them. So the publisher's response to all these pressures has been a big focus on textbooks, because they were for a long time big money-making exercises, because student numbers have grown absolutely massively, but they have been threatened quite significantly by the fact that print is a bit problematic, but also Amazon introduced a rental model for textbooks, particularly in the US, which has devastated the textbook market there. You just get a lot less money per edition than you might have done, because Amazon will rent it out to a lot more people than one single sale. We publish a lot of, along with other publishers, we publish a lot of academic reference. We've tried to publish in paperback to see if an individual print sales can work in paperback, but because online access is so easy, we haven't managed to make that work, and paperback sales are absolutely tiny now, so you lose money publishing paperbacks. Most importantly, we publish online now, and that's been the most effective way for us to counteract those forces that I've been talking about. Publishers have become very cautious about edited collections, because they seem to underperform massively, because they're dismissed as a genre. So if you ever think about editing a collection other than a reference-y collection like an Oxford Handbook, David has done some of those for me, then don't, is my advice. And historically, single country studies have become problematic for a lot of publishers, because it became a global market, and it was difficult to sustain an audience globally for something which might just focus on a particular country. But actually, I think the digital revolution is probably undermining that a little bit, given the way that we now earn our money from the titles that we publish. So I'm going to get on to something which is even more practical now. When you're thinking about approaching a publisher, then I think it's very important to get a sense of, the differences between the publishers. All the university presses can look quite similar, but in terms of their actual financial setups, and therefore the publishing decisions, the acquisition decisions they're making, they are quite different. Cambridge and Oxford are the most similar pair. They are both larger than any of the other university presses. OUP is actually 3 times larger than Cambridge, because of a lot of its English language teaching is very successful, and its educational publishing is very successful. And we also, historically, at least up until this year, have made a surplus, usually, which we then transfer to the university. Cambridge doesn't do that, but it's a big player. It's very, very large. The university presses in America tend to have a subvention either from their parent university or from their own endowment. So for instance, Princeton University Press has its own endowment. It's quite a wealthy organization, and so it can take very luxurious spurious publishing decisions. It can price very low. It publishes a very small number of titles and is very boutique, but they want to have big hits because they're doing it for the prestige and the glamour as much as anything else, I think. And they were on a fantastic list, I have to say, really, really good. But they're a very different proposition to Cambridge or Oxford, who have to publish quite a lot of material in order to keep afloat. Harvard would be very similar to Cambridge and so on. The commercial publishers like Palgrave or Routledge, Taylor and Francis, they also tend to publish a large number of titles just because they need to do that in order to be able to make any kind of return. So I can move on now if we'd like this to be more of the focus of the things that I'm saying on how to get published, the nitty-gritty of how to get published. So as I say, the first thing is absolutely to choose the right publisher, given the kind of project that you have, that you're going to write, or that you have written. Okay. Now, the reason for that is because it's historically been the case that publishers tend to focus on certain areas within a particular discipline. They can't publish across the entire board because the economies of scale of attending the conferences, buying in mailing lists to market to learning societies or whomever, mean that you need a certain number of titles, a critical mass of titles to be able to justify the marketing spend that you're going to need to engage in order to get those titles out and known and then make a return on them. So publishers do focus on certain areas, and it's absolutely crucial. The most fundamental thing you can do in the first instance is just choose the publisher that does definitely have an active presence in your area. I think that is the most important piece of advice that I can give you. So, but you know, it's not enough that they were publishing a little bit in that area or something in that area 10 years ago. They need to have an ongoing presence. So you need to see titles having emerged that you're using in terms of your research or you're assigning to any teaching you're doing. You need to see those titles having come out in the last 2 or 3, 4 years or so. That's absolutely essential. So, I mean, to give an example, the example I always give, which is sort of relevant here, is that historically, my list has not really published a great amount in Middle East politics, for instance. I did many years ago, but then it's an area that we moved out of for 1 or 2 reasons, and so we didn't really attend with any great vigor the key conferences in Middle East studies. And we didn't buy in the mailing list to mail out our latest catalog or an alert for the latest publications coming out. And so it was difficult for us, therefore, structurally as a publisher to publish a book successfully, to make an impact with a book that was in Middle East politics. So do choose, first and foremost, a publisher which is genuinely a publisher in the area that your book is. And the way to go about doing that is to look at your bibliography, see which publishers are featuring in that bibliography, and if they've got real presence there, then that's a very good sign. Check their catalogs. I mean, on the whole, a lot of publishers don't produce catalogs now. We no longer produce a political science catalog, but have a look through their publishers' website to sort of Google it and see what sort of critical mass they have there and how recent those titles were as well. That is very important, as I say. You'll know who are publishing the central books in your field, and that's the sort of publisher that you should be focusing on in terms of making an initial approach. So the next question to grapple with is, what sort of material should you send? And that varies, I think. But in the first instance, it's probably good to go with less material rather than more. It's a trope of academic editors that they are always supremely busy, but it is actually true. We get a huge amount of submissions of approaches every week and certainly every year. So I probably get, just out of not counting the relationships that I've been talking to people for a while, or that I've been trying to generate in terms of conversations and bring out of my network, or people that I've pursued because I'm interested in their work. Just across the transom projects that we probably get, I reckon it must be about, on average, it must be about 10 a week. So that's 500 or so a year, things that just kind of just come in, about which I knew nothing in advance. So I think as part of that first approach, then it's good to keep the material to a sort of minimum. Now, by a minimum, I would say something like a 10-page proposal, and in a bit I'll just run through some some useful headings, some things to think about when you're putting a proposal together. But about 10 pages should give an editor a sense of what it is the project is about, what it is you're up to as an author, you know, why it's going to be interesting, and so on. So, and include with that a CV as well, because a lot of publishers, and I'm absolutely one of those, will take a view about you know, where you've been publishing. If it's your first book, then, you know, which of the journals you've managed to publish in, and so on. These are very influential and important considerations. So in the first instance, do that. Don't weigh in with a full manuscript, because it's going to be very difficult for an editor to spend any time with that, and they're likely to think, oh crikey, I'm not going to really be able to engage with that, and therefore say no straight off. So a short, punchy proposal, I think, is probably absolutely the way to go, with a CV as well. Another question I've very often asked is multiple submission fine? Is it okay for me to send my project to more than one publisher? Now, I used to, a few years ago, I would have taken a harder line on this, but now I think on the whole it is absolutely fine to approach more than one. You know, the risks in terms of you not hedging in terms of the publisher probably outweigh any inconvenience for the publisher. I think the crucial thing about that is that you need to be transparent about it. You need to be very clear with each of the publishers that you're approaching, that you are also have sent out an exploratory message, or have a project being refereed by another publisher or another set of publishers. So do just be very clear about that. Don't sort of not mention it, and then the publisher spends a lot of time making an assessment of the material and so on, only to find out that you don't want to publish them. You've got a contract somewhere else. So do be absolutely transparent about it. Then I'm going to say a little bit about something about how to put the proposal together, as I mentioned. So the crucial thing here is don't oversell the book. So, you know, a proposal document under one description is a sort of sales document, you know, for you to a publisher. But the thing that will sell a book to an academic publisher is their judgment about the intellectual interest in that project, about its scholarly worth, about the originality of the research, about the nature of the topic and how important that topic is. All these sorts of criteria, all these sorts of considerations. These are the crucial ones that a publisher, but a publisher, you know, on the whole, editors tend to land in a job and then stay there for a long time. I mean, I have been looking around AUP doing this job for 28 years nearly. And, you know, those are the skills, that's the knowledge base, that's the wisdom, if you like. It might be overstating it a bit, but that's what we bring to bear. And so if your proposal document is saying, this is the greatest thing since sliced bread, this is a wonderful proposal for this, then it's, you know, a publisher is the one, the editor is the person that's going to make that initial judgment. Okay, you need to actually, I think, just allow your research and its interest, your topic, your approach, how you're going about it, how you're about to do it. You need that to speak for itself, I think. So don't oversell. Another question I'm asked in relation to putting a proposal together is the extent to which a book and a thesis differ, and the extent to which, relatedly, if one has a thesis which one wants to turn into a book, that should be at some distance from the thesis. Now, I actually take quite a conservative view about that. I think setting aside issues around a thesis having to go through the process of, you know, ticking the boxes in terms of demonstrating that the candidate is familiar with the research and the literature and so on, and a very elaborate statement of their method and so on, then actually the difference between a thesis and a book is not so great, I think. I think a thesis is a form of book. There are some things that one can do just to tone down that whole kind of box ticking, literature nodding, and then also, you know, a very laborious account of method at the beginning of a book. But you need those things at the beginning of books, because somebody coming to that book needs to be familiarized and oriented in terms of the research that they're about to read. So I think actually a book and thesis are actually closer to each other than you might think. And related question to that I often hear is, when, as a newly ennobled doctor, should you actually approach your publisher about the possibility of publishing? Should you do it before you've revised or after? And there's a tension here, I think, because from a publisher's point of view, it actually helps a huge amount to have a version which is revised from the thesis. So, for instance, that the early materials in terms of method and literature review are toned down or taken out to some extent. But then, of course, the problem there is the tension arises from the fact that you might have invested a lot of effort in rewriting the thesis a bit, and then find that a publisher isn't actually interested in it. And when you go to another publisher, they actually want you to reverse some of the things that you've done. So I think it's, in the first instance, when one's putting together a proposal, I think it's fine to do that in advance of actually engaging in any work on the thesis, and sketch out the difference that you want to make to the thesis, the things that you propose actually doing in relation to the thesis, to make it into more of a book-like object. That's absolutely fine, I think. And then on an individual case, book by book, project by project, an editor can then take a view about whether or not they want to actually wait for the revisions to be made and then approach referees, or whether they want to go out with a proposal sketching what's going to happen, and perhaps the actual thesis text itself, if referees might be prepared to read that. What I'll do now is strictly just run through the main headings, the main rubrics I think usefully you might include in the proposal. And different editors have different views about this. You'll see even within the same company, different suggestions on the website. But this is a good kind of broad brush sense of what a proposal should consist in, I think. Very clearly, right at the start, you need a very clear title and who you are, and a very brief account of your affiliation. Okay, that's just need that right at the top. Okay, that's very important. It might seem like a trivial thing to say, but you'd be surprised at the number of proposals where that isn't the case, and then it becomes quite frustrating to work out what on earth I'm reading. A quick side word about titles. People tend to like, when writing, they tend to like slightly oblique, elusive, perhaps slightly clever titles that seem sort of attractive, and then a subtitle which then unpacks specifically what the book is about. That's actually, in the current world, a mistake. You need a main title that is very descriptive of the project that you are writing or have written. That's absolutely essential, because online discoverability, terrible word, but online discoverability is absolutely paramount in terms of the impact that a book might make. So you need to be getting up the Google search rankings whenever somebody searches for the research, the topic that you're working on. So, and main titles, for some reason, just to do with the way that the Google background mechanics work, main titles are much more important in terms of the metadata or the data that Google works with than subtitles. So if you bury what the book's about in the subtitle, then you're going to be low down the Google rankings, and that's a real problem in terms of your potential impact and the impact of your work. So back to the proposal. Title, who you are, just very briefly. Then a paragraph, a sort of synoptic overview paragraph saying the main aims and themes of the work, just so there's something shortish there that somebody coming to it will straight away know what it is they're about to engage with when they read the full proposal. That's absolutely vital, I think. That can be a couple of paragraphs is fine, one paragraph is fine, but something that really says what it is that you're doing and what you're trying to do. Then you need something that's going to cover the relationship to the existing literature, because this is very much an area in which work doesn't come out ab initio. It comes out of a body of research, ongoing work, part of a conversation, part of a multi-log. So it's important to give a sense of which literatures this is contributing to, where it sits on that, and then given that, what the intellectual contribution is of the project. And that should be the next section or the next paragraph or two. Okay, there's a literature. You're part of this tradition, part of this discourse, but what is it that you're bringing that's new? This is absolutely vital, and do think hard about that. But again, as I say, don't oversell it, but just to be very clear about what the contribution is. Then it's important to have something on the nature of the research that the book is based on, what it's emerged out of, what sorts of methods you've been using, what data you've got, what's the empirical basis of this. Then we're on to the actual sort of description of the book, and a draft table of contents would be the next thing to include. And it need only be draft. This can evolve during the writing and during the subsequent to the refereeing process as well. But just a table of contents is absolutely vital, because it kind of gives a big picture, skeletal picture of what the book is about. And then after that, you need an account of what each chapter is up to. So 2 or 3 paragraphs per chapter of actually what they're going to be covering, what they do, and then some technical information, some boring information. How long is it? How many words? How many words is it, including notes and references? When the thing is likely to be completed, a planned delivery date. and then a short bio, what you've done, what your career highlights are. That's not so necessary, because I think, as I said before, a CV is absolutely essential, because it's a very good orienting tool for an editor as well. And as I say, but, 10 pages is a good length for a proposal, and 100,000 words is a good length for a book. But there's a lot of variation in the latter figure. So anything less, for instance, a scholarly monograph, anything less than 60,000 is starting to look a bit odd and short, I think. And then anything over 120, then there are potentially cost implications with that. Now, I think the final bit of advice I'm going to give in terms of the process of actually approaching a publisher is actually probably every bit as important as making sure you're choosing the right publisher. And in fact, speaking sort of personally, but I'm sure it's true of my colleagues across the industry, this may be the most important thing. Use your contacts. If you have somebody that you know is published with a publisher that you are approaching with a new project, then see if they'll be willing to contact the editor concerned to just say, look, you should be expecting a proposal from this person. I think their work's really good, and it's going to be worth paying attention to. I get that from fairly frequently from the great cabinet of people that I have globally, whose opinion and view I trust on these matters. So that can make a massive difference in terms of just getting a project noticed, engaged with a bit more fully, perhaps, although it's sad to say it, given that there are a huge number of projects flying towards commissioning editors every given week, as I say. So anything that will get you sort of out of what trade publishers used to call the slush pile, and noticed and engaged with by an editor is really going to help your case, because of the sheer volume of projects flying around. Editors usually take quite quick and sometimes quite brutal decisions about what they're going to invest more time in, let alone actually say yes or no to. So it is absolutely worthwhile just using your contacts, people that you know, supporters of your work, your champions, or just friends who have a relationship with a publisher, to see if they'll put a word in for you. That can make a massive difference, as I say. Maybe it would be helpful if I just very briefly went through my thought process when I get a new proposal. The first thing I do is just look at the topic and think, well, is this something that we have a bit of a track record in publishing, or is it an area that I'm keen to maybe develop in some further, a bit more? So that's the first thing. And if it isn't, then immediately even if it looks the most interesting topic and wonderfully executed piece of research, and wonderful piece of writing, if it isn't something which sits in with that sort of, with the shape of the OUP political science list, or the shapes within the OUP political science list, then it's just, there's no point in me taking it on, because I can't make a success of it. So I would be doing it a disservice if I were to take it on. So topic, absolutely crucial. And that tracks back to the point I made about choosing the right publisher, a publisher which has presence in the area that you are writing in. Absolutely essential. Then I'll have a look at, if it's crossed that hurdle, I'll have a look at the description and just try and get a sense of, what the interest of the contribution is, what it's actually saying. I'll then do something quite cynical and look at the CV and see where you've published before, where the proposer has published before, and if it's a first book, but the author has a publishing record in the journals, which is impressive, a piece in APSR or whatever, then immediately I'm going to be thinking, okay, well, this may be plausible. And then I'm into the sort of the meat of the proposal, and if I think that, okay, well, there is something going on here, it's an interesting intellectual question, it sits nicely with the list, this is clearly somebody that has got the cojones to be able to do this because they've published in good journals, then you get over that sort of stage. And the proportion of unsolicited proposals that I get that make that stage is actually tiny. I mean, I said, if we get, for instance, to pluck a figure out there, if I get 500 unsolicited proposals a year just coming over the transom, then I mean, it's single figure percentages we'll get to that stage where we're actually into the formal assessment of a project. David, would it be helpful for me, do you think, to just go through how the actual formal assessment process works at a university press like OUP, or is that a little bit too in the weeds?
No, I think it's very useful. This will be very useful.
Okay, cool. Okay, so university presses tend to pride themselves on the fact that we engage in full-blooded referee assessment, anonymous referee assessment of projects, and they kind of define themselves in contradistinction to the commercial publishers in treating that really seriously. It's a kind of badge of honor, and that patches into the fact that, you know, a publisher like CUP or OUP, Princeton or Harvard would think of their lists as just being, you know, of intrinsically the highest scholarly value. And so the way that we do that is as follows. Each of those university presses will have a scholarly and academic board. With Cambridge, it's the syndics of the press. With Oxford, it's the delegates of the press. They're effectively the same sort of body. They're made up of, and I'll just speak to the Oxford case because it's obviously the one that I know best. They're made up of leading members of Oxford University, specifically Oxford University, not other universities. And there are about 20 of them. Each delegate broadly covers a research area that the press publishes in. So there is a political science and international relations delegate, one person. This is just, I'm just going to talk about the UK experience. We can chat about America if you like as well, but it's all linked in, but they have a parallel set of delegates. The delegates have the final say about whether or not the press and its editors can offer a book contract. So they are absolutely where authority and power lies, certainly authority. So I cannot offer a book contract unless I've had the approval of the delegates of the press. And so they vet and offer a decision on every single book that the press publishes, and there are a lot. They offer a decision about whether or not, you know, the press is going to publish that. Excuse me. Now, they do that on the basis of independent and anonymous referees' reports on some sort of level of material. Now, I'll speak about the material first. So that can range from just the proposal. If you're a very established scholar with a great track record and you send a proposal into me, just running to just a few pages, I can get that read by independent referees, and I can usually get a positive decision about that if it's a good project, and we can offer a contract on the basis of that. It would usually then mean that when the book was actually written, we'd need a further referees report on the full thing, but we don't go back to the academic board. We don't go back to the delegates of the press. It's just between the editor and the author. The other extreme is we get a full manuscript read, and we normally need a minimum of 2 sufficiently positive referees reports. And those referees, I said they were anonymous. They're anonymous to the author, but obviously the author is not anonymous to them because the name is usually on the materials. And for instance, if you're going to offer a book contract on the basis of a proposal, then you're doing that as much on the basis of track record as you are on the actual material that's contained in the proposal. So it's only single blind refereeing. But we need 2 decently positive referees reports, plus usually a response on the part of the author to some suggestions or criticisms that the referee might have made, to be able to then approach the academic board, the delegates of the press in Oxford's case, which 2 positive reports, a decent response from the author, my recommendation, and normally in normal events, then that is enough for the delegates to say yes to a project. But no editor is ever in the position to preempt what the delegates say, because the ultimate authority, as I say, in terms of offering a book contract, it absolutely resides with them. And the reports guide them, the editor's recommendation guides them, but in the end, they do take their own decision. It is usually entirely guided by the referees' reports, but there's some discussion. The delegates, just the sort of background information, meet currently on Zoom, but every 2 weeks during Oxford term time, 14 meetings a year. And there are a couple of vacation meetings as well to make up to the 14. And it's quite a grand occasion. chaired by the Vice Chancellor. It used to happen before COVID times in the Clarendon building in the centre of Oxford, which is designed by Nicholas Hawksmoor. It's all very Oxford. But that's basically how the process works. Once we have a contract offer in place, then, as I say, the relationship then becomes entirely one between the editor and the author. And so any further refereeing that happens would then just be vetted by and decided upon by the editor in question. I'd say because of the importance of refereeing, we have moved to a world in which we referee more material than less. So it's rarer for us to take a decision just on a proposal now. We normally say a proposal and a couple of sample chapters to really give a sense of what the author's up to. But that does vary quite a bit. That whole refereeing process also has obviously a very important developmental value as well. So projects are genuinely improved, I think, by being engaged with by world-class scholars around the world, reading material in a kind of unbuttoned fashion because they have the mask of anonymity, so they can offer comments that perhaps they might not offer because they're writing about a colleague or a friend or whatever. So projects improve on the basis of that. And I do think it's one of the defining features of the university press that actually happens to be true, that we do, I hope, improve the quality and the interest and, for instance, also the readability of the books that we publish by virtue of the seriousness with which we treat the refereeing process. So in terms of, excuse me again, in terms of the mechanics and the tactics of getting a book contract, that's probably most of the things I can say. I very happily answer the questions, and I'll have a quick look at those in a minute. I'll just say something about what the future might hold. I mean, it is a digital world now. We'll see increasing swathes of open access publication at the book level, I'm sure. And there's a funding question around that. But if you have funding for that, publishers are going to think that it's great because they have a sort of mandate to be open access, and having a funded open access solves a lot of problems for them. I am often asked whether or not, given this digital revolution, whether or not the book actually is going to survive. I mean, there've been, across the last 20 years, lots of rumblings every now and again about the death of the book, the demise of the book. And my usual answer is, well, the first thing to say about that is that we're actually conflating two things there. So there is a book, which is a piece of written research at length, 100,000 words, say. And I think that definitely will survive because there are things that you can do at 100,000 words or whatever that you simply can't do in a 10,000 word journal article. There's a research and narrative arc. There's a series of complex overlapping arguments that you simply can't convey in the shorter form. So in terms of the importance of scholarly research outputs, then absolutely the book described in that way will survive. But then there's the question of whether or not the print book is going to survive. And I think it's definitely in recession. There's no doubt about that. It's becoming increasingly a digital online world. But certain sorts of books, as part of the scholarly terrain, as it were, as a scholarly environment, a scholarly picture, I think they will survive because the book it's a very old piece of technology, but it's also a very convenient piece of technology, the print book I'm talking about now. So, there are things that there are ways in which you can engage and move around in a print book that you simply are not currently available to you in the online environment. And people do interact with books in a very different way. And so my usual analogy is to say that, well, it's an old piece of technology for sure, but then the wheel is an old piece of technology, and we find it very difficult to get on without that. So the book, I suspect, will survive in some form, but it is very much an online world now, I think. Okay, that's me done in terms of broad things I wanted to say. Let me now have a look at, lots of stuff in the chat. David, was there anything that leapt out at you or think something that I didn't cover that you'd like me to stray on to now?
Yeah, maybe I can help with that. And there was a question from James. I'm looking for it. So James asked something like, in which stage of the book preparation process, writing process, should one contact you, contact a publisher? And I will add my own question before letting others to ask in person. What are nowadays your interests? Which topics, issues, fields you personally want to develop or think it's important to develop? So you are eager to get the word out or attention to those two topics. So two questions for now, and I will ask people later on to come in and ask their own questions.
Sure, that's great. And there are a couple in the chat as well, which I want to pick out. I think Teresa asked a very good question about online repositories and theses, which I'll come on to as well. So make sure we haven't finished without me answering that. In terms of when in the process, I think it's probably better as a general rule to approach a publisher with an initial question earlier rather than later. There's not a totally unequivocal answer to that, but I think earlier is good. If you put together a proposal of the thing that you're thinking about researching and writing, if you're a scholar that has some sort of track record, I think for somebody that's just emerging straight out of a doctorate, then usually their publishing proposition will be a version of the doctorate. So that's fine. So the question doesn't really arise there. But if you're a sort of a little more established, a mid-career scholar, let's say, then I think it's fine to approach a publisher with a proposal document right at the outset of what you're doing. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One is that you'll, quite a few reasons actually. One is that just I think in writing the proposal document, it will help you clarify structure, crystallize, think about what it is you're really trying to do and what that's going to mean in terms of a book, if a book is going to be one of your key research outputs. So I think it's got utility to you as the author and as the researcher to do that. I also think it's useful to approach the publisher from the publisher's point of view and your point of view, because you will have a sense of whether or not this is something which could be entertained by that publisher in due course. So if it turns out that you're writing something which you can't get any interest in any publisher, curry it up, then you know, I think it's time to think about whether or not a book is the right output for you, or whether or not, in fact, the research project is going to be the right thing if a book is something that you definitely want to do. So you'll know earlier rather than later whether you're entirely barking up the wrong tree, or maybe need to adjust in some sense in terms of the research you're engaging. So you don't sink all those costs in terms of research only to find out that actually, as a book, this isn't going to work for whatever reason. So you'll get an early sense check in that from somebody that knows what they're talking about, hopefully. So it's useful for that point of view. It doesn't do any harm to approach the publisher, because the worst they can say, if it's going to be possible, then is, well, yeah, this does look interesting. I probably need to see a little bit of work on this, maybe a couple of draft chapters after you've finished off your research, but nonetheless, you'll have an indicator that there is a potential avenue for you there when you do reach that stage. So I would say earlier rather than later, if you're a kind of mid-career scholar and onwards, would be my answer to that question. And then, David, your question was about what sorts of areas I specifically at OUP am interested in. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, as I mentioned during the preamble, publishers need to focus and have had to focus quite a lot into certain sorts of areas. So there are areas that OUP is quite long established in, that we continue to publish in quite a lot and quite successfully. So broadly, comparative politics, anything with a comparative dimension, because we're a big international publisher, historically has always worked for us. And so we have strength in comparative politics. Political economy as well, especially in relation to the welfare state, is an area that we have great strength in. Normative political theory, as it strays into ethics and moral philosophy as well, we're definitely interested in that. That's an area that we have great strength in historically. I have a brand spanking new-ish Africa Studies series. We didn't publish a huge amount on the purely political science side of African studies. We did a lot in development studies, but in terms of political science and international relations, then Africa is somewhere that I'm starting to publish quite a bit in. Historically, we have been, I think it's fair to say, the world's leading publisher of scholarly work on the European Union. And obviously the world has changed somewhat for an English language publisher on that particular topic, but I hope very much we will continue to be so. The European Union remains spectacularly important, despite the UK's idiotic absenting itself from that institution. Then there's a genre as well that OUP and a lot of other academic publishers have been very, very keen in, which is, and with all due deference to David, is the big academic reference work. So Oxford Handbooks is our flagship version of that, and Oxford Handbook on an interesting topic is something that OUP is always interested in, not least because we actually we sort of started that particular genre, its renaissance anyway, back in the mid 1990s. In fact, the new Handbook of Political Science was the volume that triggered the handbook craze that we've seen for the last 25 years. So I'm partially guilty in relation to that particular issue. I'm sorry, I think to say. What else do we publish in? I mean, here's the one thing I will say about this, and I hesitate a little bit, that the whole point about focus, having to stick to certain areas and not being able to publish across the waterfront, is probably not quite as true as it might have been 10 years ago, maybe not quite as true as it was even a year ago, and that's partly a COVID phenomenon. But the way that we currently sell our works into university libraries is as big bundles of, you get to buy the political science stuff that OUP publishes as a librarian, and so the individual sales success of a book is very hard to judge on the basis of that, because we're bundling material. And so there are other metrics that we might start. We've increasingly started to use to judge the success of something. So citations will be one obvious example, but there are various other alt metrics as well that we might use. And what we, as a mission-driven organization, because we're a department of Oxford University, are motivated by isn't just about making money. We need to make money in order to carry on doing what we're doing, but we want to publish research like all our authors, which is impactful. And there are different ways that we can judge impact. In the past, we used to just judge it by individual book sales, but now it's a very different and more complicated world that we're in. And so that does actually potentially free up an editor to publish a little bit more widely across the discipline and publish maybe just intrinsically interesting work that perhaps is a little bit adjacent to the kinds of areas that we might have published and focused on in the past. So the focus is sort of pulling out a little bit, as it were, I think. So I'll always take a look at and entertain and think seriously about a proposal if it's good and interesting research, I think. And that's probably more true than that might have been, as I say, 5 or 10 years ago.
Yeah. Can you take a minute to go over the questions in the chat, starting with Teresa, going to Ruti, Federico, and Judith later on. Jeff, we covered. Rob as well. I can help.
Okay. Well, can you point me? I'll do one. I'll answer Teresa, and then if I've forgotten who else I'm meant to be answering, just point me. Make sure I'm not missing any. Okay, brilliant. Yeah. So Teresa asked a fantastic question, a very important question, and one that I'm asked a lot, and I should have actually covered. So electronic repositories for theses, increasingly that is a requirement of the thesis awarding institution that the thesis then sits in and is accessible to members of that university. So that's the constrained version. I mean, it is problematic given that there isn't necessarily a huge difference between book and thesis. To the extent that there is a big difference between a particular book and a particular thesis, then having it in an institutional repository is absolutely fine, of course, more or less, or we edge towards fine, as it were. I think if the repository is simply one that's open to members of that university, then that is broadly okay. There is, if it's in a repository which is then open to the world, then that can be deeply problematic, because it does undermine to some extent our ability to sell or to have that particular work engaged with. So that can be problematic. There's no overarching easy answer to Teresa's question. There has grown up the possibility of a sort of SOP to publishers, which is that there is a moratorium on something appearing in an electronic repository of, say, 2 years after getting the thesis awarded. That's all well and good, but you know, a thesis often will take a while to revise anyway into book form, and then there's the whole production process as well, which usually runs to about 9 months, plus the refereeing process, which might run to 6 months or more. So by that point, a 2-year moratorium embargo is actually entirely ineffective. I think my sense is that it's going to become increasingly tricky for publishers to fight against this insofar as they want to. Insofar as it's a commercial threat to a given project. But I think the crucial thing is to always mention to any editor that you're talking to about a particular project and make the point that this is going to have to feature in a library repository. If there's a choice, then I would always go for the book, because you're just going to make more impact with that than you are with having a thesis lodged in a library, I think. So that's not an entirely convincing, I suspect, answer for Teresa, but there are definitely issues around there, and they need to be raised on a project by project basis between the author and the editor.
Yeah, and Ruti is asking around the book proposal, 10 pages, single space, or
yeah. I mean, this is a very I say 10. It's increased over the years. I used to say 6 or 7, and then I say 10. Yeah, I think the more the merrier, actually. Even for an initial thing. I mean, something up to 20 pages is entirely fine, because if an editor's going to bother to read something, then they need to be, then having invested that time reading it, need to be able to work out what on earth the project's about and whether it's got any value to them. So I think 10 single-spaced pages is right. Certainly not double-spaced, I think.
Yeah. There is a question from Judith in the text chat, and she says, could you say a bit more about deadlines when a contract is signed? How binding is the due date?
That's an excellent question, Julie. Now, we are recording. And, I shan't be too flippant about it. I mean, it's not eye-wateringly binding. We set a delivery date. I mean, in the end, you know, a publisher like OUP in particular, I can't speak to the commercial publishers so much, but I'm sure it's roughly the same. You know, we want the book to be in, we want the text that the author delivers to us for us to then publish to be in the best possible intellectual shape. And if that takes more time than was foreseen at the point of signing the contract, then that is usually fine. Now, and publishers are, you know, a certain amount commercially hangs on this, but nowhere near as much as might hang on it intellectually, and that's what we care about. So on the whole, there is flexibility about that. If it looks like you're going to be late with your deadline, then you should definitely let the publisher know sooner rather than later, and be realistic about what extra time you might need. I have plenty of authors who I expect their 6-month email to me saying, I'm really sorry, but you know, I haven't been able to do X, Y, and Z, and so the book isn't coming. So I've meanwhile probably pushed it out by 5 years anyway. Now, so be realistic about it and be transparent about it is my strong advice about that. It does depend on the project slightly. There will be some projects that actually might become problematic because they were particularly relevant at some point, and events have simply overtaken the project. So in those circumstances, deadlines can matter, and so you wouldn't want to play too fast and loose with those. And also, if a huge amount of time elapses, I mean, no names, no patch job, but I've signed up books 20 years ago, and I'm still waiting for the manuscript, and then an author will get in touch every now and again saying, "No, I'm going to deliver it in a year. Please still publish it." But you know, everything has moved on in that time. So if that's the kind of time frame, then it's problematic. But in terms of, let us say, a 2-month delay here or a 3-month delay there for most projects in political science, then, which is probably the fastest moving of the humanities and social sciences, then it's fine. That's okay.
Thank you very much. Can I just ask a brief follow-up? I was asking because you said that it's best to contact the publisher in a very early stage. So that means it's difficult, first of all, to plan realistically, but also a significant time can pass between the submission of a proposal and actually the manuscript if it's not already existent work. So what is reasonable as a time frame?
Okay, just in terms of the first point, I mean, I say contact the publisher earlier rather than later, but that doesn't necessarily then result immediately or fairly promptly in a contract. It's a way of just gauging interest and when that interest might be formalized. You're entirely right that the size of the variable between just a proposal document and then a final manuscript is much more significant than a project which is already written. If your question is what would be a reasonable time between a proposal being accepted and a manuscript then needing to be delivered, well, it depends on the project entirely. I mean, if this is a shortish book on something where the research is all lined up, then that would naturally be quite short. But if the proposal is to write a 10-volume history of the French Fourth Republic, then that's obviously going to take a long time if the research hasn't happened. So it does vary a huge amount, and the editor will normally offer a view on that, I think. Sometimes there might be for more popular works, so works that might be appealing to a more general reader, which we do publish some of, and academics do write. Then there might be a particular anniversary that is absolutely vital that one might publish by, and so therefore in those instances the date, the time for the manuscript to be written has to absolutely match the time that the publisher needs to then actually publish the book. So in a way it's too variable. I mean, as a very general average figure, I would say between proposal and a delivered manuscript, if the research is conducted but no writing has happened, then I would say a year is ambitious. A couple of years is probably more realistic.
Yeah. There is a question here from Ariel. Can you talk a bit about actual book contracts, obligation of the author, press, money, amounts, percentage? Yeah. And also Fabiana wants to know, how does it differ in the legal field? You're doing politics more. Can you tell us more about the legal field?
Sure. Just in terms of the book contracts, a publisher's book contracts, AUP is no exception here, are very boilerplate. The number of genuinely moving parts, i.e. parts that can be moved, is very, very small, and it will be around length, delivery date, and possibly royalty rate. They are generally left quite vague, to be honest with you, because it still is very much a kind of a collegiate, consensual sort of industry, and so it's very much about the personal relationship with the editor and just making the book project work with the author writing it. We've covered delivery dates and how strict and stringent they are, to which the underlying message was not that. In terms of money, academic publishing, it's very difficult to make money on it now. For the sorts of reasons I was suggesting, we can't make money out of online to anything like the degree we used to be able to make it out of print, and we don't sell much in print now. So in terms of this being a useful, and this is just about academic monographs I'm talking about, the big textbooks can still make quite a bit of money. But just an academic book, then nobody's going to be making much of money out of this. So royalty rates tend to be relatively low. I mean, I tend to offer I suppose this is sort of, is it confidential? I don't know. But my root rate would be about 5% of our net receipts for a relatively established scholar. So, but nobody's going to make cash out of this. We're not going to make cash out of it, and the author's not going to make cash out of it. What other elements of a contract can I talk about? I mean, there's always lots of, these are very boilerplate and also one size fits all. So contracts tend to have lots of clauses in about new editions, revised impressions, all that sort of stuff, which is meant to cover the textbook part of the publishing program that we have. And none of those things are ever really enforced. So, and the thing to remember with a contract is it's designed to cover worst case scenario. And on the whole, worst case scenarios just don't arise. So I wouldn't worry about, this is going to sound heinous, so I wouldn't worry about reading it too closely.
Yeah. What A question, yes, Fabiana's question about law, how it differs for law.
It depends which bit of law. So OUP does have a black letter sort of practitioner law strand, and that is very different because that stuff is, historically tended to be loose leaf, and the cycle of updating is very, very important because it really is at the coal face, and legislation changes, the law changes, interpretation changes. So that's a very different kind of publishing. On the academic side, we have a very strong academic law list. It's sort of the same, to be honest with you. I mean, I think a lot of the environmental pressures that I was talking about at the beginning of the session also apply to lawyers to a greater extent. That they're academics first rather than lawyers. On the whole, historically, the law market has been a bit more solid than a lot of the other humanities and social sciences. There's a bit more cash sloshing around in it as well, I suppose. Yeah. But I think it is broadly similar.
I see. There's an interesting question here from Federico, asking about the use of literary agent.
Yeah, that is a good question. I saw that when I was going to answer that.
I have one experience with that, and it wasn't useful, but curious to see.
I mean, for purely academic work, literary agents can provide a fantastic service if you are writing a book which has a genuinely broader readership. So that means a readership outside the academy. I think they perform 2 or 3 sorts of function there. They have an in with what we call trade publishers, so commercial publishers that are aimed at that general reader market, like Penguin, HarperCollins, these sorts of people, basic books. They have a relationship, and something from an agent will be paid attention to it by those publishers in a way that's just approaching the publisher as an author on your own, you simply won't get any kind of traction with them. So they provide a very valuable service in terms of that. I think they do provide us a valuable service in terms of giving an author an initial sense of whether or not the thing that they are doing for that broader readership does genuinely have appeal to that broader readership. They're very helpful in that regard. They're very helpful in terms of, if a book's then published, usually of actually helping getting it noticed as well. So they perform an important marketing function as well, often, not always. And then finally, and not least, because that sort of publishing can produce money if it's a success, still, then they are very good at getting terms which are more advantageous to the author than an author might be able to get if they just went to the publisher alone. But that's all for general reader books, where there is revenue to be made still occasionally. In the academic sector, there just is not the money to justify an agent taking 20% of whatever it is, and they, on the whole, will not want to bother to do that. I mean, our royalty payments for most monographs are in just a few £100s, and that is not the kind of beer that an agent is going to be interested in. And for that reason, if I see an academic project, the project which I see as an academic project and not reaching out to a broader audience, and it comes to me with an agent, and I'll usually just say no to it, because I think nobody's going to win from this. So I think if you want to write something which has the aspiration to be a bestseller, get an agent. If you're an academic wanting to publish and make the most impact out of a book-length research output, for goodness sake, don't.
Yeah. Another question here is about the role of series editor. What is his role in academic press, like in OUP?
Yeah, that's a really good question as well. So I've on the whole, just to give a bit of background here, on the whole historically been quite a serious skeptic, because I found that series editors added in a whole layer of bureaucracy and approval and correspondence that given that we have an academic board in the form of the delegates and that quite strict and convoluted approval processes, that didn't really help very much. But I've come round to thinking that with the right series editors, then they can be a genuine boon to the publishing that OUP does. So, for instance, I mentioned that I've got big on Africa and African politics and IR recently. The way to do that as a commissioning editor usually is to actually try and set up a series, because then you kind of, you attract material. It's a way of making a big statement about your commitment to the area and so on. And so we set up a series of Oxford Studies in African politics and international relations about 3 years ago, and we've started to publish work in that. We've been commissioning a lot in it. We've got 2, soon to be 3 fantastic series editors. And so series editors can perform a very valuable function. Now, as an author, the big question is, do you approach the editor at the publisher, or do you approach the series editor? Well, the first answer to that is depends which one you know. If you know the series editor, then approach them. If you know the publisher, then approach them. The publisher will then share with the series editors or series editor. I think if you know neither, then I think a series editor would be the person to, or series editors would be the people to approach first of all, because they will take a view about whether it sits with their series, and then they'll always contact the commissioning editor who looks after the series within the publisher. So I think you know, they perform a good function. In publishing terms, it swings and roundabouts with series. I think if you're a younger scholar and you publish in a series which is, you know, established and well respected, then that's a great boon to you, and it's going to help your book. You sit on the coattails of the series, and it's kind of, you know, intellectual capital, and it's your forerunners in that series. If you're a more established scholar, you know, there's a danger that series publishing can be a bit formulaic. Here's something else chucked out in the series. It's all a bit kind of like a sausage factory. And so I'm not sure then whether or not a series brings value, but you know, in marketing terms, it probably overall is net a genuine benefit, because once a series has established itself, then it's seen as something that people will pay attention to. They think, oh, that's the new book in that series, I must take a look at that more closely. So,
yeah. What about what determines whether a book is released in hardcover or paperback?
That's a good question. I mean, generally now my response to that question is there's just no point in publishing in paperback. We sell so few print copies of books, no matter what the price point, because it's so easily available in the online edition now. If you think of the old times when, you know, if a book was just in hardback and in your university library, you'd have to go all the way over to your university library, find out whether it was actually on the shelves, if it was open stack or not. And if it were, then you could take it out for 3 weeks. But you might get over there and find out that it wasn't there, and you'd have to return it because somebody then else wants to use it. You can't write on it. So buying your own edition made absolute sense in terms of the ease of your interaction with that material, right? You could write on it, you've got it there, you can get it whenever you want it. If you wake up at 3 in the morning, you can get it and start reading it because the Spirit has called you need to testify. Now, with something like Oxford Scholarship Online, with digital access to these things, that restriction has entirely vanished. So I can get hold of every single book that I've more or less that I've commissioned on my phone if I happen to be on holiday in Tenerife by the pool, right? Because I've got access to Oxford Scholarship Online on my phone. So I can get to any single point. Why on earth would I spend my hard-earned cash buying a copy that's in print? Now, you can say because you find print an easier medium to interact with, and I think there's some truth in that, but in terms of the actual macro picture and how that tricks out in people actually buying paperbacks, they do not. They will not pay the money because they can get it for free. So that's sort of a prelude to answering the question. I generally now tend to price entirely for institutions a short print run of a higher priced hardback that is just mopping up those libraries that don't subscribe to our online product. Very occasionally we will publish in paperback because we think, well, there might be some individual print sale here, but on the whole, that's very rarely borne out.
Yeah.
The COVID thing has probably made that much worse, so or better, depending on your point of view. So, you know, print books sales have declined. This is commercially sensitive information, but they've declined within the academic division by about 10%, I think, so far in this financial year, which is about to shut next year. So basically, it's coterminous with the pandemic. That follows years of dropping by about 5% year on year. So, and there's been a big surge, a significant surge in terms of online take-up. So it's all about digital now. So print price points are, I think, in terms of actually getting read, are entirely a red herring.
Yeah. A question from Marsha, and also a question from me. How tolerant is a publisher like OUP to an author that is write in non-native and English? This is her question. And now my question is, can I raise some funding from a public support and get my book published in softcover as soon as it appears? Would you get some funding from the authors if they help?
I'm not for soft cover, no, because for all those reasons I just rehearsed about, you know, it doesn't matter what price point or what cover you're in. We don't sell print books. It's very difficult to sell print books, and that sale is, such as we make at the moment, is declining very radically. What you could do, in principle, I suppose, is raise money to make it open access, because that is absolutely the future. Digital is the future. Print is, you know, for most scholarly monographs, it's becoming history, I think. So, and I know that people, you know, and we have evidence here that people retain a sort of a soft spot, as it were, for the idea of a book being much more accessible and more likely to be read and make more impact if it's available in paperback at a cheaper price. It won't. It's all about digital now.
I see. I'm still reading books. I'm still in reading the print.
Whenever I rehearse this argument with people, everybody says that, but the figures just don't bear it out. I mean, I like a print book as much or more than anybody else, but people just don't buy them. They do not buy them.
I see.
So,
okay.
The question before that, David, sorry, it's got a...
Non-native English writers.
That was it, yeah, and that's a very good question, actually, yes. So in principle, as I say, I can only really speak for AUP in this regard. We are, as I say, a mission-driven organization, and we want to publish the best scholarship from around the world, no matter where it comes from. And part of that picture is that we will be publishing and do publish scholars for whom English is not their native language. I mean, that goes with the territory, because English has become more or less the lingua franca of scholarly research globally. And so there are some things that we can do in terms of helping with English language editing. I think our tolerance of that is probably not as great as we would like it to be, because there are also commercial considerations around it. As I say, it's very difficult to make a return on academic publishing now in a sufficient manner to be able to continue what we're doing, which is what we want to do. And getting a full-blooded language edit for a book, a manuscript which is in, you know, effectively non-idiomatic English, is a very expensive business. Now, there's a trade-off there between, on the one hand, our perceived value of the scholarly research and how much money we can put into it, but nonetheless there are constraints around that of a commercial sustainability nature. So we can do a bit, but if there's anything that an author can do to get a separate professional editor to go through the text before it's submitted to the publisher, after it's been contracted and before production, then that is a genuine help, I think.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Dominic. I want to allow, if possible, one more question. I know that I missed few. So quick questions from the audience. Last one, opportunity. Something that I missed. So if not, maybe last words from you, Dominic. And I see something in the chat.
Yeah, I will offer, if we're still finding stuff in the chat, fine, but I will offer this last thought. I mean, a lot of this has been a little bit sort of depressing. I normally bill it as a depressing talk, but there is one wonderful thing about, and it's an overwhelmingly wonderful thing about digital dissemination of scholarly work. And that's that we do see data to show that this work is being engaged with, and over long periods of time as well. So, you know, over the years and years and years and years and years. I have books that have been in Oxford Scholarship Online since it was first brought out, or books that got dragged into it that have been published even before then. And we see usage data. It's not the most reliable data in the world, but it is genuine indication of some sort of use of the book, some sort of engagement with the book. And all our titles are engaged with, and I think significantly. So it is a wonderful thing, the fact that something that you're writing can be just quickly jumped into, and somebody can be engaged with it, and it can make an impact with them and their research agenda, and set up a dialogue, a conversation, and further the pursuit of truth. That's a fantastic thing, actually. So although it brings challenges with it, challenges of sustainability from a publisher's point of view, nonetheless, it is fundamentally heartening to see, I think.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Dominic. Maybe if you have a little bit of patience, can you recommend a book from your list that I should read? One is that you like and you did in the last year. And maybe I didn't pay attention.
Well, the book that I've had most fun with, and actually it's a couple of years old now, but the book just under about a year and a half old, is it true? The book I've had most fun with is actually a book which was aimed at a slightly broader readership, and it's published by a young guy called Jamie Susskind, and it's called Future Politics. It's out in paperback. It's aimed at a general readership, so that's readership beyond the universities, people that wouldn't necessarily have access to our online edition, hence the paperback price point. But that's a big sort of think piece around. It's a work of very accessible political theory, thinking about what the digital revolution means in terms of freedom, equality, democracy, all these things. And he writes beautifully. It's a fantastic read. And he wrote it before he was 30, so he's sort of annoyingly talented. But it's a great book. So if people haven't seen that, then I would heartily recommend it. And it is, because we published it as a trade book, as a book for a general reader, it's incredibly cheap in print.
Can you repeat the name of the author and the book?
So it's Jamie Susskind, and the book is Future Politics.
Excellent. I'm going to the publisher, to your website and looking for it. Thank you very much, Dominic. Thank you all for your kind support and participation, and the many thanks in the chat box. It's a pleasure to see you, and hope to have you again in one of those talks in Hebrew or in English. And a lot of appreciation for Dominic's work during the years for the, building the political science list and actually the profession, and coming to us and speaking with us. Thank you very much, Dominic. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for inviting me, David, and thank you for all those interesting, engaging, thought-provoking questions. I've really enjoyed it. So we'll do it again at some point in the future, I hope.
Thank you very much, Dominic, and thank you very much, Roy.
Take care.
Take care.